Hi friends, welcome to Beautifully Bookish Bethany. In today's video, I'm going to be reviewing and discussing A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J Maas after my first time rereading it. I am also going to make the case for why Nesta does not deserve as much hate as she gets. The first time that I read this, I was a much more generous rater. And it was many years ago. So at the time, this was one of the spicier things I'd ever read. Upon reread, it's definitely not. It is very tame now that I actually read romance. And I didn't love it as much as I did the first time around. However, I still had a pretty good time with it. And there's a lot of things I noticed upon a reread that maybe escaped me the first time. And I want to talk about what things I think really work in this book, why I think it is as much of a bestseller and as popular as it is, and why I think Nesta gets too much hate. Also, I've got to say, based on comments, I love the fact that my fellow lovers of Nesta somehow find my channel and gravitate here. So love that there are kindred spirits out there, but I do know there's a lot of hate for her. So if you've never read A Court of Thorns and Roses, what is this? It's a fantasy romance that is loosely drawing on Beauty and the Beast. There are definitely some scenes that are pulling from that story, but then it diverges later in the book into other mythological tales, and there's some complexity to what happens here. This book is a huge bestseller. It has sold millions of copies. It continues to get reprints, and it has lasted a long time. This first book came out back in 2015. 9 years on, it's still a top best-selling book. Why is that? Why does it seem to have so much staying power for people? Because the thing is, you'll hear a lot of criticism of this book. There is certainly criticism to be made. Fantasy world building isn't the best compared to other fantasy authors. The writing isn't as good as it could be and is too simplistic. There's anachronisms and things that don't necessarily make sense. There are characters who do things that are kind of messed up, and then we're supposed to want them as love interests. So why? Why does this book capture so many people's attention and keep them riveted? One thing is, I think it's really easy access to the genre. Now, have I read fantasy with far better world building? Yeah, of course. But this kind of world building is sort of a mash of some modern conveniences with some historical things, enough to give you the fantasy vibe that you want, without sacrificing too much in the name of historical accuracy, which personally think is okay. I don't know that books need to be historically accurate unless they're trying to be historically accurate, and this isn't. It's a fantasy novel, right? So does it give kind of ye old-timey vibes to it? Sure, but it's not set in a specific time period, and there's magic fae with wings. So, you know, we're not trying for historical accuracy here. And while the characters are definitely messy and not ideal, one thing I will say about them is most people who read this are gonna have strong feelings about her characters. And that is a skill, to be able to write characters that people love or hate. Not everybody can do that. I can't tell you how many books I've read that have characters that are just incredibly bland, and I'm not going to remember them. They're not memorable. These characters are memorable, they're complex, they're morally gray. Nobody is really, not nobody, but very few people are all good or all evil. There's people who do evil things for reasons of survival or because of trauma that they've experienced. And that doesn't necessarily mean it's okay, but it's interesting, right? I mean, I think about the kinds of TV shows that capture people's imaginations, and it's things like House of the Dragon, right? Are any of those characters good? No. Some of them are doing really morally reprehensible things, and yet we find ourselves riveted to what they're doing. They're fascinating, they're interesting, we root for them, we care about them, we remember them. And I think Sarah J Maas is able to write characters like that, especially in the ACOTAR series, which will eventually bring me to Nesta, who is a hated character by a lot of the fandom. But again, she's a character that people have a strong emotional reaction to, and I think that's part of why this series ends up being so gripping to people. Because it's not the world building. The world building is fine. It does make it easily accessible, though, for people who are not big fantasy readers, and I think that is probably part of why this has appealed to such a large audience. A lot of people picking these books up don't read fantasy books, and relatively speaking, this is pretty easy to just dive into and mostly follow fairly well, even if you're not a big fantasy reader. And yet, the scope of things that are happening are epic in scale. There are politics, there is death, there is magic, there is betrayal, but at the same time, it's a romance, right? Sarah is not interested in writing the next Game of Thrones. She's doing this interesting thing of sort of picking what she likes from different things. So the complex, morally gray characters of things like a Game of Thrones or a Robin Hobb book, mixed in with romance and more melodrama and a little bit more accessible world building, and something that is going to end happily for our main couples. She pulls from various fairy tales and mythologies and just kind of cobbles them together, but it works. And I don't know that anybody else has really done what she's done. So can we criticize things about this? Can we say, okay, well, the world building isn't really that great. The writing really isn't that great. Sure. Could we say that in this part of her career, she was not doing a good job of diversifying her cast of characters? Absolutely. However, there is something here that keeps people coming back and hooks people in, and I think there is a good reason that these are runaway bestsellers. And so rereading it, I was reminded of that, because how many people hate Tamlin or hate Nesta and maybe think, oh my god, Rhys is doing really bad things, but I don't care because I love him so much, because there's something compelling about him and Feyre's relationship. Not everybody feels the same. We did a live show discussing this recently, and one of the things I talked about, and it was a shared thing, was that the first time I read this, I was shipping Feyre with Lucien. I never liked Tamlin. I thought he was a walking red flag from the get-go, and I was like, why not Lucien? He's cool, you're friends, you have good banter, and obviously that's not the direction that Sarah decided to go, but the fact that there are so many side characters that she writes who feel like fully fleshed out people that you can have opinions about and discussions about, that is a skill, and that is not a thing that everybody can do. And I feel like over time she's gotten better at things like inclusivity, some elements of writing craft, although some of that might be debatable depending on who you are. This thing of having interesting, complicated characters who are really memorable is part of what keeps these in people's brains. Her books live in people's heads rent-free, and even people who read them and hate them have strong feelings about them. It's not bland. It's not the kind of book that's like, yeah, that was fine. It was like some basic bitch fantasy that I'm not going to remember in 2 seconds. It's memorable whether you love it or hate it. So I find that really interesting. So I know I've been alluding to it, but let's talk about Nesta. Nesta is Feyre's older sister. She is one of 3. Nesta, Elaine, and Feyre. Now, I have the unpopular opinion, Court of Silver Flames, which is Nesta's book, being my favorite book in the series. So I have a soft spot in my heart for Nesta. I like prickly female characters who are broken and need to go through a process of healing, and her book spoke to me on a really personal level. I loved it. But this was the first time that I went back to the beginning and reread this, knowing what I know now from Nesta's perspective. And I know that not everybody is going to agree with me, but let me just tell you what my experience was and what I took away from this. The first time that I read this book, I remember hating Nesta. I thought she was the worst. I thought Elaine seemed really nice and sweet. Feyre was the heroine of the story. Reading it now, I felt quite differently. One thing that I think is important to note is that this book is written in first-person perspective, so everything is being filtered through Feyre's view of the world. Everything that we're being told about Nesta, aside from specific dialogue moments between the two of them, is Feyre's perception of who Nesta is and how things were happening. considering what we know about Feyre and her age when things started happening and part of her characteristics, I don't know that she fully grasped everything that was really going on, and I don't know that she was fully fair to Nesta. Now, do I think Nesta was the perfect sister? No, of course not. They were all deeply traumatized and dealing with trauma in very different ways. But remember that you have to kind of take things with a grain of salt when you're getting this sort of a first-person perspective in a book. I'm going to put this down because I'm talking a lot and my arms are getting tired. So the girls came originally from a very wealthy family. Their parents were trash. They're both pretty terrible people. Their mother died soon after they lost the family wealth when Feyre was around 12 years old, and on her deathbed, her mother asked her to take care of the family, which is a really shitty thing to do to your youngest 12-year-old daughter, but she did, and Feyre took that on seriously and then decided, well, I'm gonna go out and teach myself how to hunt and bring food for the family and do what I can to listen to my mother's dying wish. We find out in Nesta's book later a lot more about their mother, things that Feyre was too young to really remember and too young to have been exposed to, that Nesta went through as the older sibling, that are pretty awful and explain a lot about why Nesta is the way that she is and the challenges that she is specifically going through. But keep in mind, right, they lose all their money because of their dad's bad business choices when Feyre is 12 and her two other sisters are in their teens. The three of them respond to the trauma that they go through in very different ways. Feyre is like, well, I'm going to go be the independent one and I'm going to try to work myself to the bone to protect my family and do whatever I can. Elaine is kind of useless, does nothing, lets everybody take care of her and protect her, and just puts on her blinders and is like, I'm going to ignore anything bad in the world and la la la, be in my own kind of land, right? Nesta is angry. She's angry at her mother. She's angry at her father for not doing anything to take care of them, because you know who should have been putting food on the table? Their father, but he was not doing anything. And so she has a lot of anger and resentment for her parents, but she tries to keep things together on the home front. And there are indications, if you read between the lines, even in this first book, because yes, people say, well, maybe she tries to redeem herself later in the series, but even in this first book, she does quite a few things that are much more complicated and not reprehensible in the way that people like to paint her as being. There is a moment between her and Feyre later in the book where she gives the indication that she really struggled with the fact that Feyre was so independent and didn't need her protection as an older sister. And maybe Nesta resented that a little bit. And Feyre, being out hunting and doing all of this physical labor, I think didn't see some of what Nesta was trying to do to keep the family together at home. And then after Feyre leaves and gets taken to the Fey realm, Nesta is again the one that keeps the family together. And we find out that she is so strong-minded, she resists the Fey glamour, so she knows where Feyre really is and has to act like she doesn't because Elaine and her dad just, like fall prey to it. But not only that, she tries to go after Feyre. She knows that she could die in that circumstance. You want to say she's a bad sister, but she literally tried to go after her and was unable to because of magic. So I feel like Nesta has been done a disservice. Is she the perfect sister? Did she do some kind of messed up stuff? Sure. But I feel like all three of them are so deeply traumatized and dealing with that trauma in different ways and all need to find healing. I'm really curious to see in the future what Sarah might try to do with Elaine's book and Elaine's perspective. So far, she has continued to be kind of useless, a little bit boring. I'm curious to see where that's gonna go in the future of the series, but I just think Nesta deserves more credit than she actually gets, and I don't think Feyre is as perfect as people want to make her out to be. Is she the heroine of the first 3 books in the series? Yes, but again, this is all being filtered through her worldview and her perspective, and it may not all be entirely accurate, right? No character is a perfectly reliable narrator. That said, there are some things that I really like about how Sarah approached setting up this story that I noticed. One thing is that when we go into this, Feyre is not a virgin. She's been fooling around with the farm boy. He'd been taking a tonic so that she wouldn't get pregnant. There is some thought given to those things. And so when she gets into this situation with Tamlin, she's not a virgin, right? It doesn't have that kind of weirdness. It's a more sex positive approach to telling this sort of a story. Feyre is 19 years old. She's got some experience. Is she dealing with somebody who is hundreds of years old? Sure, but she's not completely naive. She's been through some shit and she knows some things. Now, I will say again, I always thought Tamlin was a walking red flag and is also just really boring. I never understood the people who really liked them together in book one because, okay, they're attracted to each other, but their interactions are so bland. The first time that he bites her, and yeah, maybe she kind of likes it, but I feel like the underlying violence of it is foreshadowing more physical violence to come in later books. And so it feels like the early warning signs of an abusive relationship. We're already seeing him be overprotective, a little bit controlling. Again, it gets more serious in future books, but you see those things start to happen here. And there's the fact that the whole time he is manipulating her, right? He brought her there and is trying to fall in love with her because he hopes she can break the curse if she falls in love with him. So of course he's being nice to her and like giving her an art gallery and whatever. I just don't understand the people who were really in love with him as the love interest from book one. I never was. I was always like, why not Lucian? He's nice. He's funny. You get along. You have good banter together. He has a personality. He's much more interesting than Tamlin. And I just felt that even more strongly on a reread. Lastly, I want to talk a little bit about Rhysand, because when he's introduced in the book, he's doing some kind of terrible things. And in book one, we don't know that much about who he is and his motivations, but we get hints and learn bits and pieces about Amarantha and his relationship to her, that what he's doing is a matter of survival for himself and for his people, that he does some admittedly wrong, morally questionable things, but maybe for good reasons, and maybe because he's just trying to survive them. And even think about the way he treats Feyre are in a similar vein. So on the one hand, he does this whole thing of having the body paint on her so that nobody else can touch her at these parties and drugging her for these parties, which on its face seems really terrible. Like, you are drugging this woman and forcing her to wear these revealing clothes and whatever. But on the other hand, you consider the fact that he's, in a way, doing it to protect her. He's drugging her so that she doesn't have memories of those nights and the trauma that might come along with that, or the trauma of what might happen if she was resistant to whatever was happening. And doing the body paint, he makes sure that nobody else is touching her. Nobody else is violating her, and he keeps his hands only on her waist, so it's for appearances only. So is it good? No, but is it better than the alternative? Is it with the intent of trying to protect her? Yes. And that's what I think makes Rhys such an interesting character, and I think so compelling to a lot of readers, is that he does these things that seem violent and seem really out there, but eventually he explains himself, and eventually we get an understanding of why he does the things he does, and usually they're for protection or for survival. So yes, is he a little too alpha for my tastes at time? Of course. Does he do some things that I have questions about in later books? Yes, and we will eventually get there, but I think there's a reason that a lot of people like him so much. That said, I was always shipping Lucian with Feyre, but she's happy, I guess, with her man, so it's fine. So, A Court of Thorns and Roses, I didn't want to do a full recap. I feel like so many people have done that. I'm doing them for the Throne of Glass books, but I just didn't feel as interested in doing it in this case. But I did have some things that I wanted to say. One final point is on connections to the larger Sarah J Maas world or the multiverse. There is not a whole lot here, except for the fact that we get information about the mythology of the cauldron and the way it was used to create the world of Prithian. So we know a little bit about their gods and goddesses, about these different creatures, about the cauldron, and that mythology will get further developed in future books and then will be linked into things we find out later that affect the multiverse. But for the most part, this is a pretty self-contained story at this point, and there's not too much else to say. On a reread, I gave this book 3 stars, but it's like a loving 3, a high 3. Maybe it should be a 3.5. I might think about that. And I can see why it has continued to grab on to so many people's attention and has been a great entry point into the genre for people who haven't read it before. Talk to me in the comments down below. Let me know any of your thoughts on this video. Do you agree with my perspective? Do you disagree? Do you love Nesta? Do you hate Nesta? Let me know in the comments down below. If you like this video, it always helps if you give it a thumbs up. Subscribe if you want to see more. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.